The moment Abigail Keating pressed the barrel of her Winchester rifle against the chest of the man trying to steal her last sack of flour, she decided that the West had won too many worthless men in it, and she was done entertaining any of them. That had been 3 years before Ralph Hunter rode into Dust Creek, New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1882, and the reputation of Abigail Keating had already spread to every trading post and saloon between Santa Fe and the Arizona border. She was the widow of Thomas Keating, a man who had made her 7 promises on their wedding day and broken every single one of them before the consumption took him at 31. She had buried him herself, because there was no one else willing to dig in the hard caliche ground, and when the preacher from the neighboring settlement of Redrock finally arrived 2 days late and asked if she wanted to say words over the grave, she had looked at him with those dark amber eyes of hers and said, "I already said everything I needed to say when he was still breathing." She ran the Keating homestead alone after that. 240 acres of high desert land, a modest herd of 20 cattle, a kitchen garden that she coaxed out of the cracked earth by hauling water from the creek half a mile away, and a house that needed a new roof but got a patched one instead because Abigail Keating used what she had and asked nobody for what she did not. She was 29 years old, lean and sun-browned, with dark hair she kept pinned back under a battered hat, and hands that were rough from work but moved with a precision that surprised people the first time they saw her repair a bridle or skin a rabbit or pull a difficult calf from its laboring mother at 2 in the morning. She was not cold, exactly. She had warmth in her, buried deep and well guarded. But she had learned to distrust warmth offered by strangers, and she had learned even more firmly to distrust men who arrived with easy words and wide smiles, which was exactly what made Ralph Hunter such an irritation the first morning she saw him. He came into Dust Creek from the north, riding a big gray horse with a worn saddle that had seen considerable weather, and he stopped at the general store run by Edna and Carl Morrow without any of the swagger that most newcomers brought with them. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been lived in hard, a jaw that was square and deliberate, dark eyes set under a brow that seemed naturally inclined toward a slight furrow, as though he was always turning something over in his mind. He wore a plain canvas duster that was dusty from the trail, and he did not carry himself like a man who was looking to impress anyone. He simply looked like a man who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. Abigail was at the Morrow store to collect a bolt of canvas she had ordered 2 weeks prior. She was standing at the counter when he came in, and she noticed him the way you notice a thundercloud on the horizon, not with alarm necessarily, but with a wary attention. Carl Morrow, who was round and cheerful and talked too much, immediately launched into the kind of introduction that Abigail had grown to dread. "Miss Keating, this here is Ralph Hunter. He's taken on the old Bellard property out on the Eastern Road. Ralph, this is Abigail Keating. She runs the old Keating spread by herself, which is something most men around here are still too proud to properly admire." "Carl," Abigail said, without looking up from the bolt of canvas she was checking for moth damage, "I did not come here for an introduction." "No harm meant," Ralph Hunter said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not perform itself. He did not extend his hand, which she noted. He simply collected what he had come for: a tin of nails, a coil of rope, a small sack of salt, and he paid Carl Morrow without ceremony. He was almost to the door when Carl, who could not help himself under any circumstances, called after him, "You ought to know, Miss Keating is the finest cattle woman in the territory. If you ever need advice on the land out east, she's the one to ask." "Carl," Abigail said again with a little more edge. Ralph Hunter paused at the door and looked back at her. He did not smile, did not offer any soft flattery. He just said, "Good day to you, Miss Keating," and walked out. She watched the door swing shut behind him, and she told herself that was fine. That was exactly the way it should be. A man who minded his own business was a man she could tolerate. The trouble was that the Bellard property shared a fence line with the Keating property along the eastern edge, and within a week, it became apparent that the fence in question was in a state of considerable disagreement about where exactly it stood. Abigail discovered this when 3 of her cattle wandered through a gap in the old wire and ended up grazing on the first green shoot of winter rye that Ralph Hunter had apparently planted on what he believed was his land. She rode out there on a cold October morning with the sky the color of pewter and found him already there, standing at the gap in the wire, looking at it with that thoughtful furrow between his brows. He had 2 of her cattle on a lead rope, calm and unhurried, as though returning livestock to their rightful owner was just another ordinary morning task. "Those are mine," she said, pulling her horse up short. "I know," he said. "I was going to bring them to you." "I would have found them." "Probably," he agreed, and handed her the lead rope without making anything of it. She took it, studying the fence. "This line needs to be resurveyed. The original posts were put in by Hector Bellard, and he was not a man of great precision." "I noticed," Ralph said. "I'll pay for half the surveyor if you're agreeable." That surprised her. She had expected either a fight over the land or some ridiculous attempt to play the generous neighbor. A straightforward split of the cost was neither. "I'll agree to that," she said carefully, as if she was waiting for the catch. There was no catch. He simply nodded and went back to examining the wire. She rode home with her cattle and spent the better part of that evening thinking about the fact that Ralph Hunter had not said a single word more than was necessary, had not tried to charm her, had not attempted to make himself indispensable or impressive. In her experience, men did one of 2 things when they met her. They either underestimated her, or they overcompensated by piling praise onto her capabilities in a way that felt like they were trying to soften her up. Ralph Hunter had done neither, and it nagged at her like a loose thread. The surveyor came the following Thursday. His name was Eli Prout, and he had been surveying New Mexico land for 20 years, and when the work was done, it turned out that the true fence line sat about 12 feet east of where Bellard had placed it, which meant that 12 feet of Abigail's kitchen garden and 1 full acre of her grazed land were technically on the Keating side. She had not mentioned any of this beforehand, not wanting to prejudice the outcome. When Eli read his findings aloud in front of both of them, Abigail watched Ralph Hunter's face carefully. She had seen men transform when a financial matter went against them, and she was prepared for the shift. He did not shift. He looked at the results, nodded once as if the world had simply confirmed something he had half expected, and said, "Then I'll need to move my fence posts." "You'll move them yourself?" she asked. "I put them in, I'll move them," he said simply. "It's the honest thing." She did not know what to do with that, so she thanked Eli Prout, paid her half of his fee, and rode home without saying anything else to Ralph Hunter. But she thought about him that night, and she thought about him the next morning when she hauled water from the creek, and she grew annoyed with herself for thinking about him at all. November came in cold and hard that year, and the whole of Dust Creek felt it. The creek itself ran low, and 3 families in the settlement had already moved on toward California, tired of the fight the land demanded. Abigail was not tired. She had a different relationship with hardship than most people. She did not love it, but she did not fear it either. It was simply the condition of her life, and she had made her peace with that. She was in the middle of patching a section of her barn roof one gray afternoon when she heard a horse on her road and looked down to see Ralph Hunter riding up with a bundle lashed across the back of his saddle. He stopped at the base of the barn and looked up at her. "You need a second pair of hands on that," he said. "I've managed every roof I've ever patched," she said. "I can see that," he said without any diminishment in it. "But the pitch on that corner is steep, and if the board shifts while you're nailing it, you could come off that ladder. I've got no appointment this afternoon. If you'd rather I not, say so and I'll ride on." She looked at him for a long moment. The corner of the roof was steep, and the board had already shifted twice, and she had caught herself on the ladder both times with her arms more than her feet, and her arms were tired. "Fine," she said. "Come up." They worked for 2 hours without much conversation, and she discovered that Ralph Hunter worked the way he seemed to do everything steadily, without fuss, without needing acknowledgement of the work as it went. He handed her nails when she needed them before she asked. He held the board flat without being told. When it was done and they climbed down from the ladder, she offered him coffee because that was the honest thing, and he accepted without making it anything more than it was. They sat at her kitchen table with the November wind complaining around the corners of the house, and he drank his coffee and looked at the room with the manner of a man who was looking at a place rather than evaluating a woman, and she found she could sit across from him without the tightness in her chest that most male company produced. "Where did you come from?" she asked. It was the first personal question she had offered him. "Colorado," he said. "Before that, Kansas. Before that, Indiana, which is where I was born." "What brought you out this far?" He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. She disliked men who answered personal questions too quickly, as if they had a prepared version of themselves ready at all times. "I had a ranch in Colorado," he said. "Lost it in a land dispute. It was a legitimate loss. I did not have the paperwork properly filed, and the law was not on my side. I spent a year in Pueblo being angry about it, which was not useful. Then I came south looking for land I could afford, and that was real." "Real," she repeated. "Not a speculation. Not a promise of water that turns out to be 6 months of rain and 8 months of dust. I looked at the Bellard place for 3 weeks before I bought it, walked every acre, checked the creek, looked at where other men had planted and whether it had held." He paused. "It's real land. It's hard, but it's real." She understood that distinction at a level that had nothing to do with property. "Yes," she said, "it is." He finished his coffee, thanked her for it, and rode home. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray horse diminish down the road until it was gone, and she told herself very firmly that she was not interested in Ralph Hunter in any way that was going to cause her trouble. The lying to herself lasted about 3 weeks. It was Edna Morrow who first said it out loud, because Edna Morrow could not keep things to herself any better than her husband could. Abigail had come to collect mail and found herself answering a simple question about how the fence resurvey had gone, and somehow she talked for 10 minutes about the way the dispute had been handled, and then another 5 minutes about the coffee in her kitchen, and Edna Morrow looked at her with those mild brown eyes and said, "Abigail, you're talking about that man like you're thinking about him." "I'm talking about a property line settlement," Abigail said. "You are talking about the way he moved the fence posts himself," Edna said. "I've heard you tell 3 fence line stories in my life, and none of them sounded like that." Abigail took her mail and left. But the observation had planted itself somewhere she could not pull it out again, and in the following weeks she began to notice things about Ralph Hunter with a clarity she could not blame on practical necessity. She noticed the way he was patient with his horse, never demanding more than the animal had to give. She noticed the way he was quiet in the general store but not unfriendly. He answered questions when asked, helped old Ben Castor lift a feed sack without making a ceremony of it, and never seemed to need the room's attention turned toward him. She noticed, on the day the temperature dropped hard and a blue norther came screaming out of the northwest, that he appeared at her fence line to reinforce the posts that the cold had heaved, and when she came out to ask what he was doing, he said, "Your posts on this end were sitting loose. Cold'll push them right over and your cattle will scatter. I was doing mine, so I did yours." "You should have asked," she said. "Would you have said yes?" She paused. "Probably not." "Then I saved us both a conversation," he said, and went back to tamping the post. She wanted to be irritated and was not, which irritated her more than anything. It was at the Dusk Creek Winter Gathering, an informal affair held in the Morrow store every December, where the settlement families came together to trade, share food, and remind each other that they were not alone in the middle of the vast cold desert, that the conversation happened. The one that changed things. It was a crowded, warm evening, smelling of pine pitch and coffee, and the dried apple cake that the Hawkins sisters always brought. Abigail was standing near the stove with a tin cup in her hand when Ralph Hunter appeared beside her, and they stood for a while watching the room without any need to fill the silence, which was in itself unusual enough to notice. Then Jeb Craddock, who was 3 whiskeys into the evening and had been circling Abigail with vague romantic intentions for 2 years, appeared on her other side and leaned in close and said, "Miss Abigail, I've been meaning to tell you that you are the finest-looking woman in the territory, and I think you and I would make a fine match if you'd give it consideration." Abigail turned to look at him with the full weight of her amber eyes and said, "Jeb, I appreciate that you've been drinking, so I'll be gentle. I have no interest in hearing what kind of match I'd make. You've told me before that your land would do well with mine, that we'd build something together, and that you'd take good care of me. Those are soft promises, Jeb. Every man who has ever wanted something from me has led with soft promises. I have no use for them." Jeb Craddock backed away with a look on his face like he'd been politely but firmly kicked, and several people nearby had heard enough of it to find something else suddenly interesting to look at. Abigail turned back to the stove. Ralph Hunter was still there. He had not made any move to distance himself from the conversation, and he was not looking at her with the wide, sympathetic eyes some men used in moments like this, trying to position themselves as the understanding alternative to whoever had just been rejected. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, low enough that only she could hear, "What kind of promise would you take?" She looked at him, surprised by the directness. "I don't know that I'd take any." "You'd take a promise that meant something," he said. "You just wouldn't take a comfortable one." She studied him. "What do you know about it?" "I know that soft promises are ones a man makes because they cost him nothing to say. He promises good care, good land, good company, and all of those things are feelings, not actions. You can feel all of those things on a Tuesday and feel none of them by Thursday." He looked into his coffee cup, and there was something in his face that was old and honest. "I made soft promises once, to someone who deserved better. I have not made them since." There was a silence between them that had weight. "What happened?" she asked, because she found she needed to know. "She died," he said very simply, and it was not said with the performance of grief but with the plain fact of loss. "Her name was Clara. She was my wife. She died in childbirth along with the baby 7 years ago in Colorado, and I spent a long time after that asking myself what I had actually done as opposed to what I had promised. The answer was not comfortable." Abigail looked at him for a long time. She had not expected that. She had expected something easier, something that would let her keep him at the same careful distance she kept everyone. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it without any decoration. "I am too," he said. "But I learned something from it. I learned that a promise has to be something you can do every day, or it's just a wish with a bow on it." She did not answer, because she was thinking about Thomas Keating and his bow-tied wishes, and she did not trust her voice with that particular piece of her history. But she turned and looked at Ralph Hunter, and for the first time she let herself really look, not at the potential problem of him, but at the actual man. And what she saw was someone who had been worn smooth by real things, who had no performance left in him, who was standing next to her at a winter gathering in the middle of the New Mexico Territory in December of 1882, telling her the truth about himself with no obvious motive. She was 30 years old and had not felt her heart move in 4 years. She felt it move now, just slightly, just enough, and she put her tin cup down and went to talk to Edna Morrow because she needed a moment to breathe. The winter deepened, and with it, so did the strange and careful dance that was developing between Abigail Keating and Ralph Hunter, though neither of them would have called it a dance. They were too honest for flattering names. He began to leave things at the fence line. Not gifts, not the kind of offering that was meant to accumulate obligation, but practical things, left without announcement. A length of good hemp rope that she had mentioned her barn was short of. A small bundle of salt for her cattle when she had mentioned the supply was low. Once, after a particularly brutal freeze, he came over not to the fence line but to her door, and when she opened it he simply said, Your creek access trail has iced over and you'll break a leg hauling water. Let me break a path for you." And before she could decline, he was already walking toward the creek with a long-handled pick and the matter-of-fact purpose of a man who had decided to be useful rather than charming. She made him breakfast when he came back. It was the first meal she cooked for him, and she did it without ceremony: eggs, bacon from the smokehouse, biscuits from the oven. He ate with the honest appetite of a man who had done cold work before dawn, and he thanked her in a way that was genuine without being excessive. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "You broke ice for an hour. It's a fair trade." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I wanted to." She sat across from him with her own breakfast, and they ate together in the winter morning quiet of her kitchen. And it was comfortable in a way that was almost frightening to her, because comfort was something she had learned to be suspicious of. Comfort had preceded every disappointment she had known. She told him that later in the meal because she had never been a woman who kept her actual thoughts disguised. "I mistrust this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the table between them. "This," he said, "this easiness. I have sat across from men at this table before and it always felt like they were calculating something. You don't feel like you're calculating." "I'm not," he said. "Which is either true or very good acting," she said. "I suppose you'll have to watch long enough to find out," he said, without any pressure in it. She looked at him steadily. "You should know something about me. Thomas Keating told me he would love me, provide for me, be a partner to me, and build something real with me. He said these things before we were married, and he meant every word of them in the moment he said them. But meaning a thing in a moment is not the same as it being true across time. I did 3 people's worth of work for 6 years and buried him in ground I had to chip it myself, and had not one person in the world to stand beside me at that grave. I am not angry about it anymore. But I am not ever going back to a place where I believed soft words and found empty hands." Ralph Hunter listened to every word of that and did not flinch from any of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I understand that, and I will not ask you to take anything on faith. I only know one way to show you what I mean, and that's to be here doing what needs doing for as long as you'll allow it." "That is not a promise," she said. "No," he agreed, "because I don't make those lightly anymore." She thought about that for a long time after he left. She was still thinking about it 2 weeks later when January turned bitter, and she found herself, for the first time in years, hoping she would see someone's horse on her road. January in the New Mexico territory was the kind of cold that crept through every gap in a building, that turned water in the trough to a solid block overnight, that made the cattle press together in the lean-to for warmth and the horses restless with the discomfort of it. Abigail managed her stock through it as she always did, methodically and without self-pity. But a heifer she had been watching came to difficult labor in the second week of January, and she lost 2 of the 3 nights' sleep fighting for the calf. She got the calf in the end. It was a good calf, a bull calf, solid and healthy once it found its legs, and she stood in the barn in the gray pre-dawn light of the 3rd morning feeling the satisfaction of that in her tired bones. Then she heard the creak of the barn door and turned with her hand moving automatically toward the rifle she kept hung near the stall. "It's me," Ralph Hunter said from the doorway. "Carl Morrow mentioned your heifer when I was in yesterday. I came to see if you needed an extra hand." She looked at him and then at the calf, now nursing steadily, and something behind her eyes went warm and undefended for just a moment before she could bring it back. "We managed," she said. "I can see that," he said, and the way he looked at the calf was the way a man who knew cattle looked at one that had been well brought in. Not praise, not performance, just recognition. "Good calf," he said. "Strong legs. He'll be a good bull in a few years," she said. Ralph looked at her then, really looked, and she knew she was hollow-eyed from the sleepless nights and her hair was half fallen and there was blood and hay on her shirt, and she did not care in the way she would have cared once, because she was past the age of apologizing for the evidence of her own hard work. He just said, "Have you eaten?" "Not since yesterday evening," she admitted. "I'll make something," he said, and walked toward her house like it was already settled. She stood in the barn a moment longer, one hand on the calf's warm flank, and felt the terrifying nearness of something she had been keeping at arm's length for months. Then she followed him inside. He made cornmeal mush and fried the rest of the bacon that was in her cold box, and they ate at her table in the early winter morning, and she was so tired that her defenses were thin, and she said things she would not have said with a full night of sleep behind her, things about Thomas, about the years of loneliness, about the way the land felt sometimes like the only honest relationship she had left. And he listened with the full attention of someone who was not waiting for a chance to speak, who was simply receiving what she offered, and when she was done he said, "You did not deserve any of that. You deserved better." "I don't know that deserving has much to do with what life hands you," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it should." And the way he said it carried something, not bitterness, but a kind of determined grief, as though he had decided that the gap between what should be and what is could be closed, one action at a time. She fell asleep at her own kitchen table shortly after that, her cheek against her folded arms, and she did not feel herself go. She woke an hour later to find a blanket placed carefully around her shoulders and Ralph Hunter gone, with the dishes washed and stacked beside the dry sink, the fire built up in the stove, and a fresh bucket of water beside the door so she would not have to go out immediately. She sat at that table for a very long time, wrapped in that blanket, and felt something in her that she had thought was finished beginning, very quietly, to move. February came, and with it the kind of thaw-then-freeze cycle that made the trails treacherous and the livestock miserable. The settlement at Dusk Creek was insular in the winter, each family or individual managing their own parcel of difficulty, and Ralph Hunter's parcel was considerable. The Bellard property had been neglected for 2 years before he bought it, and he was repairing fences, reshoring the barn foundation, digging irrigation cuts that the previous owner had left half-finished. She rode past his land sometimes and saw him at this work, always steady, always unhurried in his pace, even when the scale of what he was doing was plainly vast. She stopped one afternoon in February without knowing she was going to. Her horse just slowed on the road adjacent to where he was working on a fence section, and she sat there and watched him for a moment, and then he looked up and saw her. "Coming from somewhere?" he asked. "Reed Rock," she said. The town of Reed Rock, 12 miles distant, was where she had gone to sell 3 cured hides and collect a letter from her sister in Missouri. Her sister Nora wrote once a month and Abigail wrote back, and these letters were one of the few soft things in her life that she allowed herself without reservation. "Good ride?" he asked. "Cold," she said, "but good. My sister writes that she's having another baby." She was not sure why she said that. It was simply what was in her mind. Something in Ralph's expression softened. "How many does she have?" "2. This will be 3. She married a man in Independence who runs a dry goods store, and she is happy, I think. She says she is." She paused. "I believe her. Nora does not have my difficulties with honesty in letters." "What are your difficulties?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I tend to write what is true rather than what is comfortable," she said. "It makes the letters shorter than she would like." He laughed at that, and it was a real laugh, low and surprised, and she felt it do something to the air between them. She had not heard him laugh before. He did not do it easily, which made it mean something when it came. "Your sister worries about you," he said. "It was not a question." "She always has," Abigail said. "She thinks I am too alone." He was quiet for a moment, looking back at his fence work. "Are you?" The question was so direct that it bypassed every guard she had built. She sat with it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, which was more than she would have admitted 6 months ago. "But I prefer honest alone to dishonest company." "So do I," he said, and looked up at her, and the look held something that was neither demand nor question. It was simply recognition, 2 people who had come to the same understanding by different roads. She rode home with her cheeks warm in a way that the cold February air was not responsible for, and she wrote to Nora that evening a letter considerably longer than usual. It was March when he finally said it plainly, which was fitting because March was the month when the desert showed its first color again, when the scrubby chamisa put out yellow blooms, and the creek ran bright with snowmelt from the mountains, and the whole landscape seemed to remember that it was capable of beauty. He came to her door on a Saturday afternoon, and she opened it to find him standing there with his hat in his hands, not from nerves, she thought, but from courtesy, and he said, "I'd like to walk with you if you're willing." She studied him. "Walk where?" "Wherever you'd like," he said. "I just want to walk with you." She got her coat and walked with him along the creek trail, and the afternoon light was the color of honey, and the water talked over its stones in the way it did in early spring, and the mountains to the north were still white at their tops. They walked for a while in comfortable quiet, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she stopped too, and the amber light was on both of them, and the world was very quiet except for the water. "I am not going to tell you that I love you," he said, "because I am not sure those words have meant very much in your experience, and I don't want to use them carelessly. But I want you to know that you are the most honest person I have ever met in my life, and the most capable, and you are the only person I have found in a long time that I want to be near for reasons that have nothing to do with what I need and everything to do with who you are. And I would like to spend more time with you, if that is something you could consider." Abigail looked at him and felt the familiar rising of her wariness, the old instinct to retreat, to protect. But underneath it was something else, something that felt like spring water, cold and real and clean. She said, "I told Jeb Craddock at the winter gathering that I have no use for soft promises." "I remember," he said. "And I told you what Thomas did to me," she said. "You did. So I am asking you plainly," she said. "What would you promise me, Ralph Hunter, if you were going to promise anything? Not something fine-sounding, something real." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him thinking it through carefully, which was the only right way to do it. Then he said, "I would promise you this. I will not leave you without being honest about it first. I will not make you carry what should be shared. I will not make a claim on your independence because it is one of the finest things about you, and I will show up. Every day that I am breathing and able, I will show up." She felt the weight of that settle over her. It was not a pretty promise. It had no flourish in it. It was, in fact, a harder promise than any Thomas Keating had ever made, because it was specific and it was daily and it left no room for the easy amendment of feeling. "That is one promise," she said. "It is," he said, "because one I can keep." She looked at him for a long time with the creek running beside them and the honey gold light going soft at the edges, and then she said, "I am going to hold you to that." "I know," he said, and from the way he said it she could see that he understood this was not a romantic concession. It was a contract, and he had signed it with full knowledge of what it cost. They walked back in the slow afternoon, and when they reached her door she said, "Will you come to Sunday dinner tomorrow?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Good," she said, and went inside. She stood at her kitchen window and watched him ride away toward the eastern road, and she pressed her hand flat against the cool glass and felt her own heartbeat against her palm, and she thought, "I will watch. And if he comes, I will believe it slowly." He came to Sunday dinner. He came the Sunday after that. He came through April and into May, and he came not only to dinner but to the work of her property, the spring calving, the irrigation ditch that had partially collapsed in the snowmelt, the replanting of her kitchen garden which had suffered through the winter. He did not take over any of it. He asked what was needed and did that part, and when she had a way she preferred to do something he learned her way and used it. People in Dust Creek began to notice, and people in Dust Creek being what they were, they began to talk. Old Ben Castor told Carl Morrow that it was about time. Edna Morrow told the Hawkins sisters that she had seen it coming since December. Jeb Craddock drank somewhat more than usual for a period of 2 weeks, and then recovered his dignity and tipped his hat to Ralph Hunter when they passed on the road. Because Jeb was not a bad man, only a weak one. One May afternoon, With the sun warm and the sky that particular deep blue of New Mexico spring, Abigail was planting her bean rows and Ralph was repairing the fence on the south edge of her property, having noticed on his own that 3 sections needed new wire. She was not watching him, or telling herself she was not, but she was aware of him the way you become aware of something that has begun to belong to your landscape. Her sister Nora arrived that day, which was not expected. Abigail looked up from her bean row to see a wagon coming down the road with a man she recognized as Nora's husband Francis Webb driving, and Nora herself enormous and 8 months along, wedged among enough luggage for a month's stay. Abigail stood up slowly, brushed her hands on her trousers and said, "Nora Webb, you rode 12 days from Missouri in that condition." "I wanted to see you," Nora said, as Francis helped her down with the careful attention of a man who was terrified of doing it wrong. "And I wanted to meet the man you've been trying very hard not to write about, but keep writing about anyway." Abigail turned to find Ralph walking up from the fence line with his tools in hand, having seen the wagon arrive, and the look on his face when he registered the situation. The very pregnant woman, the obvious sister resemblance, the husband lifting bags from the wagon, was one of swift understanding followed by the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes that she had come to know was his version of a smile. "Ralph Hunter," she said, with a dignity that she felt was somewhat undermined by the dirt on her hands. "This is my sister Nora Webb and her husband Francis. Apparently they have come from Missouri." "We have," Nora said, offering her hand to Ralph with an openness that Abigail had always envied in her. "And you are exactly as she described without describing you." "Nora," Abigail said. "It's a pleasure," Ralph said, and shook Nora's hand and Francis's hand, and then helped Francis with the bags with the simple practical efficiency of someone who saw what needed doing. And Abigail stood in the middle of her kitchen garden watching this happen, and felt something large and quiet settle into place in her chest. Nora stayed 3 weeks. In that 3 weeks she managed, without appearing to try, to create the conditions under which Abigail and Ralph had their first evening of actual sitting together by choice, that was not disguised as a meal or a work arrangement. It was a warm May evening, and Nora had declared she was tired, and Francis was inside reading to her, and Abigail came out to sit on the porch to watch the desert go purple and gold in the dusk, and Ralph, who had stayed for supper and had been on his way to his horse, simply sat down in the second chair instead. They sat for a long time watching the day end. The sky went through coral and orange and deep violet, and the first stars appeared over the mountains, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made its sound. "She's good for you," Ralph said, meaning Nora. "She's relentless," Abigail said, but without heat. "You missed her," he said. "Every day," she said, and it came out without guarding, and she let it stay out. He reached over then slowly so she could see it coming, so it was not a surprise, and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. He did not grip it or perform anything with it. He just placed his hand there, warm and steady and patient. She looked at their hands for a long time. Then she turned hers over and held his, and they sat like that until the stars were fully out, and neither of them said anything that needed saying because everything had already been said by the plain fact of it. Nora had her baby 2 weeks after she returned to Missouri. It was a boy, and she sent a letter to Abigail saying his name was Thomas Francis Webb and that he was perfect. And Abigail sat at her kitchen table and cried a little, which she did not do often, and allowed herself to be glad. Summer in the New Mexico territory was a trial of heat and dust, and the constant management of water, and in the summer of 1883 Dust Creek faced a particular difficulty. A man named Harlan Voss had come to the territory with money from somewhere that nobody examined too carefully, and had begun acquiring water rights on the upper part of the creek that fed both the settlement and the surrounding homesteads. Voss was not violent. He was, in his way, worse than violent because he was legal. He had filed the proper paperwork, paid the proper fees, and under the territorial water law of 1882, He had a legitimate claim to a portion of the flow that he intended to divert for a large-scale cattle operation he was establishing to the north. The problem was that diverting that portion of the flow in the dry months of July and August would leave the settlement and the surrounding homesteads with insufficient water. It would not destroy anyone overnight, but it would start the slow squeeze that the territory had already seen do its work on a dozen smaller communities. Some would sell and move. Others would fight through on reduced water and reduced herds and reduced futures until the land defeated them by degrees. The meeting at the Morrow store in June was loud and unhappy. Ben Castor wanted to confront Voss directly, which was the kind of thinking that had gotten Ben Castor into 3 legal troubles in the past 15 years. Several of the farming families wanted to simply sell before the water situation worsened, which Abigail understood even as she disagreed with it. The Hawkins sisters, who had been on their property for 18 years and had no intention of leaving, sat with their arms folded and looked like they were prepared to outlast a biblical flood. It was Ralph Hunter who stood up and said, "There is a legal remedy." The 1866 Mining Act established the doctrine of prior appropriation for Western water rights, and under that doctrine, any person who has been diverting and using creek water continuously and beneficially prior to a later filer has a prior claim. Most of us have been using this water for years. Voss filed in April of this year. If we can document our prior use, we can challenge the filing. The room went quiet. Carl Morrow said, "Who would know how to go about something like that?" "There's a land attorney in Santa Fe named Horace Gilman who has handled territorial water cases," Ralph said. "I know of him from my time in Colorado. He is honest and his rates are fair. If the community agrees to share the cost, I'll ride to Santa Fe and make the case to him." Abigail looked at him across the room. He was not making this proposal with any show. He was simply laying out what he knew, offering what he could do. She thought of how he had come back from the fence survey without any grievance. She thought of how he had broken ice on her creek trail at dawn. "I'll contribute to the cost," she said, "and I'll document my own prior use of the water back to 1878, which is when my husband and I came to this land." Others followed, and by the end of the meeting there was a plan and a collected fund, and Ralph rode to Santa Fe the following week with the community's records and Horace Gilman's address. He was gone for 12 days, and Abigail discovered during those 12 days that the landscape of her daily life had shifted in a way she had not fully registered until the absence made it plain. The creek trail was not the same without the knowledge that at some point in the day a gray horse might appear on the eastern road. Her kitchen table at Sunday morning felt different. The work was the same, but something in the quality of the days had changed. She wrote to Nora, who wrote back within the week. The letter must have crossed hers in the mail, and Nora's letter said, among other things, "Abby, you are in love with that man. I watched you watch him from the porch for 3 weeks. I know what you look like when you have feelings, because you get very still, like a deer that has heard something and has not decided yet if it's dangerous." Abigail folded the letter and put it in her bureau drawer and sat for a moment with the understanding that she had been seen, which was both uncomfortable and a relief, and that Nora was right, which was the most uncomfortable thing of all. Ralph came back from Santa Fe on a Thursday evening in late June, dusty and tired from the long ride, and he stopped at her place on his way home because he had news and because she thought, watching him come up the road, that he had also simply wanted to. "Gilman thinks we have a strong case," he said, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the map of water rights he had brought back. "He's filing a challenge to Voss's claim on the basis of prior beneficial use. It will take time, possibly through the winter, but he believes the territorial court will uphold the prior claims." "That's good news," she said. "It is," he said, and looked up from the map. "How are things here?" "Fine," she said. "Calf I was watching grew well. Kitchen garden is heavy. I patched the well cover that rotted through, and I helped old Ben Castor get his mule out of a ditch." He shook his head slightly with that crinkle at the corners of his eyes. "Ben's mule is a menace," he said. "It certainly is," she agreed, and then she said, because Nora's letter was still in the bureau drawer making itself known, "I missed you." The words came out plainly without any preparation or decoration, and she felt the vulnerability of them like a sudden wind, and she kept her eyes on the table. Ralph set his coffee cup down and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought about you every day I was gone." She looked up at that. His dark eyes were on her with a steadiness that did not waver. "I am not saying that lightly," he said. "I know you are not," she said. They looked at each other across her kitchen table in the warm June evening, with the light going orange through the window, and something that had been building quietly for 8 months reached a point that was no longer avoidable. She stood up, and he stood up at the same moment, and they moved together without any of the awkwardness she might have expected. And he put his hands on her face with a gentleness that was particular and considered, as though she was something he had thought about holding and was being careful with the reality of it. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was not like anything Thomas Keating had ever done, because it had none of that grasping quality that had made her feel, even in the beginning, like a possession being claimed. This was different. This was an exchange between equals, honest and warm and full of things that had been carefully built for 8 months and were now, finally, allowed to be what they were. She put her forehead against his, and they stood like that for a moment in the middle of her kitchen, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that this was the most real moment she had known in a very long time. Summer deepened, and the water case moved through the territorial court, as Horace Gilman had predicted, slowly, with documents and arguments and the particular patience that legal proceedings required. Harlan Voss's attorney, a man from Albuquerque named Strickland, was skilled and not easy, but Gilman was better, and the community of Dust Creek had records going back years documenting their water use, which was the foundation of the prior appropriation claim. Abigail contributed her own meticulous farm records, which went back to 1878, and noted water usage season by season with the kind of specificity that had originally been practical habit and turned out to be legally useful. Meanwhile, what was happening between Abigail Keating and Ralph Hunter was happening in the way that things happen between people who do not rush and do not perform gradually, and then completely. He came to her property every day, as he had promised, though the promise had been about showing up in the broad sense, and what it meant in practice was that they moved through the work of their two properties with increasing integration, making decisions about cattle and water and fencing and planting, as a pair without either of them having formally defined anything. People in Dust Creek had stopped speculating and started simply assuming, which was fine by Abigail because assumptions required nothing of her. One evening in August, sitting on her porch with the heat of the day finally easing into the cooler dark, Ralph said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer, whatever it is, will not change anything about how I am here." She looked at him. "Ask. Will you marry me?" he said. It was not quite a question in its delivery, not because of arrogance, but because he had been moving toward it with the same steady deliberateness he brought to everything, and the asking of it was less an uncertainty than a direction he had decided on and was stating plainly. But then he added, "I am not asking for your land or your independence or any diminishment of what you have built. I am asking if you want to build the rest of it together." Abigail was quiet for a long time. She looked out at the desert night, at the stars that were thick as scattered salt over the mountains, at the darkness of the land she had fought for and won from and loved in the complicated way you love things that have cost you. "What is the one promise?" she said. He understood. "I will show up," he said. "Every day I will show up." She turned to look at him. "I believe you," she said. And then, because she was Abigail Keating and she had earned the right to mean what she said, "Yes." He took her hand and held it in both of his, and she felt the warmth of his hands and the solidness of him, and thought that this was not like the first time she had been asked by anyone. The first time there had been excitement and youth and the bright feeling of something beginning. This was not that. This was better than that. This was knowing with the full weight of experience what it cost to build a life with someone and choosing to do it anyway, and choosing this person specifically, this man with his quiet steadiness, his hard promise, his showing up. They were married in November of 1883, exactly 1 year after the winter gathering where Jeb Craddock had made his soft proposals, and Ralph Hunter had asked her what kind of promise she would take. The ceremony was held in the Morrow store, which was the largest enclosed space in Dusk Creek, and Edna Morrow had decorated it with dried wildflowers and lit enough candles that the whole room glowed. The preacher came from Reed Rock this time at the right time, which Abigail noted with a private satisfaction. Nora Webb came from Missouri with baby Thomas on her hip and Francis beside her, with the look of a man who had learned to roll with his wife's decisions, and she wept through the entire ceremony with the openness that Abigail had always loved about her. The Hawkins sisters wore their best dresses. Old Ben Castor sat in the front row and blew his nose with a volume that made the preacher lose his place briefly. Carl Morrow told everyone who would listen that he had known from the very first day, which was both slightly inaccurate and entirely harmless. Abigail wore a dress that Nora had brought from Missouri, deep blue wool that fit her well, and had a simple cut that suited her better than any elaborate style would have. She had not bought anything new for herself in 3 years and put on the dress that morning, with a feeling she had not expected, not girlish delight, but something quieter and truer, a kind of settledness, the feeling of arriving somewhere she had not known she was walking toward. Ralph wore his good suit, which had seen better years but was well kept, and stood at the front of the Morrow store and watched her walk toward him across the plank floor, with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the stunned admiration of a man seeing something pretty, but the look of someone receiving something they had valued for a long time and were being trusted to hold. They said their vows with plain words. The preacher offered the traditional language, and they said what was required of them. And when it was done, and he was permitted to kiss the bride, Ralph kissed her with the same care and honesty with which he did everything. And the room broke into cheering that included Ben Castor, loudest of all, and the Hawkins sisters clapping in the particular way that suggests they have been waiting a considerable time for this. Afterward, with food and fiddle music and more candles than the room really needed, Abigail stood with Nora against the wall while Ralph talked to Francis Webb about irrigation methods in Missouri, and Nora said, "You look different." "Different how?" Abigail said. "Like you're not watching for something bad to happen," Nora said. Abigail considered that honestly. "I am still watching," she said. "Old habits." "But not with that tightness," Nora said. "You know the look. The one you've had since I was 18 years old, like everything good might disappear if you took your eyes off it." Abigail watched Ralph listening to Francis with the genuine interest of someone who collected useful information wherever he found it, and the ease with which he moved through a room full of people who had all decided they liked him, and she thought about what she had felt the morning after the wedding ceremony. The morning when she woke in the bed that was now shared and heard him in the kitchen before her. And the particular quiet of that was different from every morning quiet she had known. Better in a way that she had not had a word for before, but now understood, was simply the sound of a kept promise. "Perhaps a little less tightly," she said to Nora, and Nora put her arm around her and pressed her head briefly against Abigail's shoulder, and Abigail let her. The water case was decided in February of 1884 by the Territorial Court in Santa Fe, and the ruling came down in favor of the prior claimants of Dusk Creek. Harlan Voss's filing was invalidated on the grounds that the existing users had established their rights through continuous and beneficial prior use, and Voss was required to modify his diversion plans to leave the lower creek flow unimpeded. Horace Gilman sent a letter with the ruling that was exactly one sentence: "Prior appropriation doctrine holds, and the creek is yours." Ralph read the letter aloud at a community gathering that Carl Morrow organized immediately upon its arrival, and the Morrow store broke out in noise that could be heard from the road, and Ben Castor hit the counter with his fist hard enough to rattle the tins, and the Hawkins sisters exchanged a look that carried 18 years of held ground. Abigail stood beside her husband and felt the specific satisfaction of a fight won through documentation and persistence and shared cost, which was the best kind of winning, because it was earned rather than taken. The spring of 1884 came in warm and early, and with it came the news that Abigail had been hoping for and half afraid to believe. She confirmed it with the certainty of her own body in March, and she stood in her kitchen garden in the early morning light trying to decide how she felt and discovering that she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, not afraid of the future, but moving toward it. She told Ralph that evening at supper. She set down her fork and looked at him and said, "There is going to be a baby." He went very still for a moment. She watched his face, and what she saw there was not the performance of joy, not the bright, immediate surface emotion that Thomas had shown when she had lost her first pregnancy at the end of their first year, a brightness that had evaporated within a week because it was not anchored to anything real. What she saw in Ralph was something deeper and more careful, the look of a man who understood the weight of this, who had lost in exactly this way before, and for whom the news was both beautiful and solemn. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" was the first thing he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm well, I'm strong." "I know you are," he said. "I just want to know how you feel." She looked at their joined hands. "Scared," she admitted, "and glad both at the same time." "That is exactly the right way to feel," he said. And then he stood up and came around the table and held her, not dramatically, not with the exuberance that would have been too much, but with the solid, quiet warmth that was his way, standing behind her with his arms around her while she sat in the chair and looking out the kitchen window at the spring evening, and she felt the steadiness of him at her back and thought that whatever came, she was not going to face it alone this time. The months that followed were, in Abigail's private reckoning, the best months of her life, which she admitted to no one, because she was still Abigail Keating and superlatives made her nervous. But they were. The combination of being well and working and growing something, the particular quality of Ralph's presence that had always been good and was now deepened by a shared anticipation, all of it added up to something she had not known she was missing until she had it. He was there for everything. He hauled water without being asked in the later months when hauling tired her. He sat with her in the evenings when the baby's movement kept her awake, and she did not want to wake him, and he was there anyway because he had noticed. And they would sit together in the lamplight and talk about the small things and the large things in the easy way of two people who have run out of reasons to be careful with each other. He read to her sometimes. He had a small shelf of books that had traveled with him from Colorado, and among them a volume of natural history that she found unexpectedly fascinating. And they would sit with the book between them and he would read and she would ask questions, and it was, in its quiet way, one of the happiest things she had ever done. The baby was born in October of 1884. It was a long labor, and Ralph sat outside the bedroom door for all of it while Edna Morrow, who had attended more births than the Dust Creek doctor, managed the proceedings inside. Abigail was strong and the baby was strong, and in the early morning hours of a Tuesday, a boy came into the world with the full voice of someone who intended to be taken seriously. Edna opened the door and said, "You have a son." And Ralph stood up from the chair where he had been sitting for 11 hours with the patience of someone who had decided, some time ago, that waiting was just another kind of showing up. He came in and Abigail was exhausted and clear-eyed and holding a small, wrinkled, impossibly alive person, and she looked up at Ralph, and the look between them was the kind that does not require language. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with the expression she had seen on his face only a few times, when he looked at the land after a good rain, when he watched the creek run clear in the spring. the particular look of someone who finds the world's capacity to be good slightly astonishing. He put one finger into the baby's fist, and the baby held it with the automatic grip of the newborn, and Ralph looked at that small grip for a long time. "What will we name him?" Abigail said she had been thinking about it for months but had not wanted to choose before he was real. She looked at Ralph now because this was not a decision to be made by one person. Ralph thought about it with the care he brought to everything. "I would like to name him James," he said, "if you're agreeable. There's no particular reason except that it seems like a solid name, a name that stands on its own." "James Hunter," Abigail said, trying the weight of it. Her own family name was gone from hers now. She had taken his, but she thought she did not mind that in the way she had feared she might, because she had remained Abigail through and through, and no name change altered that. "James Hunter," she said again. "Yes, I'm agreeable." She fell asleep a little while later with the baby in the crook of her arm and Ralph's hand on her shoulder, and she slept deeply and without the old vigilance, the guard that had been at the edge of every sleep she could remember for years and years, and in its place was something she could only call peace, which was a word she had never trusted before but was beginning to understand was not softness. It was not naivety or the absence of knowledge about what life could cost. It was something harder than that. It was what you got when you had done the work and chosen well and built something real. James grew through the winter of 1884 into the spring of 1885 with the cheerful insistence of a healthy child, and the Keating Hunter household adapted around him with the practicality of two people who were not strangers to hard work and who applied to parenthood the same direct competence they applied to cattle and irrigation. Abigail nursed him and carried him and worked him into the fabric of her days, and Ralph was present in the mornings and evenings, and on the days when the baby was difficult with a steadiness that did not vary with his patience or mood. They had formally combined their two properties by the spring of 1885, running the cattle operations as one under the Hunter name, which gave them a herd of 43 head and enough shared land that the labor, while still considerable, was manageable between them. Ralph hired a hand for the summer months, a young man named Dario Sandoval from the settlement of Ojocaliant to the north, who was 22 and willing and quick to learn, and who turned out to be good company and a solid worker. Dario ate supper with them most evenings and held James with the tentative care of someone who was not sure he was doing it correctly, which made Abigail softer toward him than she would otherwise have been, because there was something honest in the admission of uncertainty. The territory itself was changing in those years. The railroad had come to Albuquerque in 1880, and the ripples of that were still moving outward, bringing more settlers, more commerce, more of everything, some of it welcome and some of it less so. The land around Dust Creek was increasingly valued, and with increasing value came increasing pressure on those who had held it early. Ralph watched this with the attention of someone who had already lost property once to the complications of legal and financial forces, and he was careful with their paperwork in the way that experience teaches. He filed the combined property deed with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe in June of 1885, making a trip down specifically for the purpose, and he came back with every document stamped and registered, and stored them in the tin box under the bed that had been Abigail's filing system since Thomas Keating's time, and he took the time to organize the whole collection into a proper order while he was at it, which was not something he had announced he was going to do. It was simply a thing he did. Abigail found the neatly organized documents when she opened the box to add the receipt for a cattle sale, and she stood in the bedroom holding the papers and felt an emotion she could not name for a moment, and then could. It was gratitude, which was different from relief, and it was accompanied by the quiet, deep satisfaction of loving someone competently and being competently loved in return. She went out to find him at the fence he was mending on the south boundary, and she walked up beside him and said, "You organized the deed box." "It was a mess," he said, without looking up from the wire. It was, she agreed. She stood beside him for a moment. Thank you. He did look up then briefly with that slight crinkle. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't, she said. I wanted to. He heard the echo of what he had said to her years back about thanking her for the breakfast after the ice. He did not point it out, but the recognition of it moved through his face, and she saw it, and they stood there at the fence on a June afternoon understanding each other completely. The summer of 1886 brought a dry spell that was difficult for every ranch in the territory, and it was managed on the Hunter property through careful conservation and the irrigation cuts that Ralph had extended in the spring. The cattle were reduced to their hardiest stock through the August heat and brought back through the fall, and by November they were in good condition, and the ranch's finances were sound if not lavish. Abigail had started keeping chickens in the previous year, which she had resisted for years on the grounds that chickens were troublesome, and discovered that the egg income was consistent and useful. And she told Ralph one evening with a directness that he found amusing that she had been wrong about the chickens. I was wrong, she said, and I am telling you I was wrong, and you are not to make a thing of it. I was not going to, he said. You had that look, she said. What look? The amused one, she said. I am always slightly amused, he said. It does not mean anything specific. She looked at him with her full amber-eyed attention, and he kept his expression even with the control of someone who was, in fact, quite amused, and she pressed her lips together and then laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had never given easily and gave freely now, and the sound of it filled the kitchen. James was 2 years old that fall, and had the opinions of someone considerably older. He had Abigail's eyes and Ralph's deliberateness, and he applied both to the project of moving through the world on his own 2 feet, with the particular purposefulness of a toddler who has decided he is ready for whatever comes next. He followed Ralph around the yard with a miniature seriousness that made Dario Sandoval dissolve into laughter, which made James look at Dario with Abigail's most precise evaluating expression, which made Dario laugh harder. Nora came again in the spring of 1887, this time with 2 children, little Thomas, now 4, and a daughter named Eleanor born the previous year, and Francis, who had developed an appreciation for New Mexico landscape that surprised him. He stood on the edge of Abigail's land and looked at the mountains and said he understood now why she had never left, which Abigail thought was a kind thing for a dry goods man from Missouri to admit. The 2 sisters sat on the porch one afternoon with the children playing in the yard and Ralph and Francis off looking at the cattle, and Nora said, "Tell me." "Tell you what?" Abigail said. "How it is," Nora said. "Truly, not the letter version." Abigail was quiet for a moment, watching James chase after a remarkably patient cat who had been on the property since before James was born, and had developed considerable skill at maintaining dignity under pursuit. She thought about how to say it honestly. "It is," she said slowly, "better than I thought anything could be, and I want to say that carefully because I do not mean that it is easy. Last February was very hard. We lost 12 head of cattle in a freeze, and we had 48 hours where I was not sure the rest of the herd would make it, and Ralph and I did not sleep and worked in the dark with lanterns, and there were moments that were not romantic in any way, but he was there, every hour of it. Not because I asked, and not because he was performing virtue. Because he is a man who shows up, and I believed that about him when he first said it, and I have watched him prove it for 3.5 years since." Nora was quiet, listening. "I told him when we first were, whatever we were in the beginning, that I had no use for soft promises," Abigail said. "I meant it. I had been surrounded by them my whole life. My father made them. Thomas made them. Every man who came through this territory with hope and charm and plans made them, and the promises were made of air, and when the air warmed they just expanded and then they were nothing." She paused. "Ralph made one promise, one, and he has kept it every single day of our marriage. Every day he is here, And I will tell you, Nora, it sounds like a small thing when you say it, but it is the largest thing there is." Nora reached over and took her hand, and Abigail allowed it, and they sat like that for a while in the spring afternoon. "You are happy," Nora said, "not a question." "I am," Abigail said. "I have decided that that is allowed." Nora laughed and squeezed her hand, and somewhere in the yard James caught the cat with a crow of triumph, and the cat submitted with the weary grace of the long-suffering, and the afternoon went on golden and warm around them. In the summer of 1887, Abigail became pregnant for the second time, and this time there was less fear in it, not none, because she had learned enough from life to never expect ease to continue simply because it had begun, but less. She was 34 years old and strong from years of physical work, and she moved through the pregnancy with the practical accommodation of someone who knows that life continues to require management regardless of condition. Ralph noticed things before she asked for them, as he had the first time. He adjusted what he asked of her without making it obvious that he was doing so, a consideration she appreciated deeply, because she had spent enough years being managed in ways that reduced her to resent anything that felt like being handled. He did not handle her. He simply paid attention, which was different. This baby came in March of 1888, and it came quickly, which was its own kind of difficulty. Edna Morrow barely arrived in time, and Ralph, who had been sent for her, came back to find it nearly done and spent the final minutes of it holding Abigail's hand through the door of the bedroom that she had half opened in the urgency of the moment and not cared about propriety. The baby was a girl, and Abigail looked at her with the same clear-eyed wonder she had felt with James and said, "Hello," to her as though she were greeting someone she had been expecting. They named her Clara. It was Abigail who suggested it, because she had thought about it and felt that the name belonged to someone real and beloved and gone, and that it deserved to be carried forward rather than left to settle. Ralph looked at her when she said it, and the look on his face was one of the most complicated and honest things she had ever seen. Grief and gratitude and love, all together, not separate but mixed, the way real feelings always are. "Clara Hunter," he said. "Clara Hunter," she confirmed. He held the baby that evening with a stillness that was different from the first time. When he had held James, there had been wonder in it and a careful joy. Holding Clara, he was very quiet for a long time, and Abigail watched him from the bed and understood without words what this cost him and what it gave him, and she loved him for the fullness of it, for being a man who did not push grief down or dress it up, who held both his lost daughter's name and his living daughter's small face with equal honesty. "She looks like someone who has already made up her mind about things," Abigail said. Ralph looked at the baby's face, then at his wife. "I wonder where she gets that," he said. Abigail smiled. The years that followed were years of building, of the particular compounding richness that comes when two people who have each known real loss choose deliberately every day to make something together. The Hunter Ranch grew steadily. By 1890, they were running 80 head of cattle and had expanded the kitchen garden into a proper kitchen orchard, with apple and apricot trees that Abigail tended with the devotion of someone who had been waiting her whole life for something to be permanent. The trees took years to bear fruit, which suited her, because she was a woman who had learned that anything worth having was slow. James started school in the autumn of 1889 at the small schoolhouse that the settlement had finally managed to build and staff, and he went with the attitude of someone who was going to investigate the situation thoroughly before forming any opinions. Clara, who was 18 months old and had the opinions of someone considerably older, was outraged by his departure every morning and consoled herself by following Ralph around the yard until he involved her in whatever he was doing, which she accepted with the imperial satisfaction of someone who has gotten what they wanted. Dario Sandoval, who had worked for them each summer season for 4 years, came to Ralph in the autumn of 1889 with a manner that suggested he had something to say and was working up to saying it. Ralph sat down with him on the porch and let him work up to it. Eventually, Dario said that he had been offered a piece of land 30 miles north near Ojo Calian that he could afford to buy if he saved through one more summer, and that he was thinking of starting his own operation, and that he wanted to know if Ralph Hunter would think badly of him for it. Ralph told him that any man who didn't take good land when he could get it deserved to lose it to the man who would, and that Dario was a fine worker and had learned cattle well and would do fine. Dario shook his hand with the grip of a man expressing more than courtesy and said that he would bring his children to see the Hunter Ranch someday, which turned out to be true. He came back 8 years later with 3 children and a wife named Rosaria and land that was thriving, and they sat on the porch and ate Abigail's apple cake and talked about water and cattle, and the way the territory was changing as the century turned. The territory was, by 1890, considerably different from what it had been when Abigail first came to it as a young bride in 1876. The railroad network had expanded. Towns that had been settlements were now proper towns. Dusk Creek itself had grown from its handful of homesteads and a general store to a community of 80 families, with a school and a church and a second store and a physician who came from Santa Fe twice a month. The physician, a serious woman named Dr. Harriet Lyle, became one of Abigail's closest companions because they shared a directness that each recognized and respected, and they had long conversations on the porch about the particular condition of women in the territory, what was changing and what was not, what they each had earned by force of character that should have been available by simple right. These were conversations Abigail had not had in years, and she valued them. She was 37 years old by 1890 and had the perspective to see her own life clearly. She had come to the territory young and been shaped hard by it. She had lost things, her first marriage, a pregnancy in those early years that she had never spoken of widely, years of loneliness that had formed the hard shell that took Ralph Hunter months to crack. She had not been diminished by any of it. She had been made particular by it, precise and strong and clear-eyed about what mattered and what did not. And she had found, in the particular form of one steady, quiet, faithful man, the companionship that the precision and strength and clear-eyed quality in her had needed without knowing it. He still showed up every day. That was not poetic language. It was the literal truth, which was better than poetry. He rose before her and built the fire and started the coffee, and he went out to the animals in the early light and came back for breakfast. And through the day, he was there in the specific, tangible, undeniable way of a person who has decided that showing up is not occasional or conditional, but simply how they live. When James was sick with fever for a week in the winter of 1891, Ralph sat up with him the first 2 nights to let Abigail sleep. And when Clara fell from the fence rail in the spring of the same year and broke her wrist, he rode for Dr. Lyle himself at a pace that said everything about how he felt about that small girl. He was not a man of demonstrative emotion, in the way that some men wore their hearts outward. He was instead a man of consistent action, which Abigail had learned was worth more than any demonstration, because demonstrations cost a moment and actions cost every day. She told him so, one evening in the autumn of 1891, sitting on the porch in the last light with the children asleep inside and the first chill of October in the air. She said, "I need you to know something." "Tell me," he said. "When you said you would make one promise and keep it," she said, "I believed it because I had no other option. I was so armed against everything that I had to find some way through to it. But I did not know truly what it would look like, what it would be in the actual daily life of it." She paused. "I know now, and I want you to know that you have been better than your word. You said you would show up, and you have shown up, and it has been—" She paused again, looking for the word she meant and not a prettier one. "It has been the making of me, Ralph, not the you of it alone, the doing it together of it, the way it turned out." He was quiet for a moment. She saw something move in his face that was the depth of what she had just said going all the way down into him. Then he said, You are the most honest person I have ever known, and the bravest. Not because of anything dramatic, because of every morning you got up when you had good reason not to and did the work and kept yourself. I have been lucky. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him in the last autumn light. We have both been lucky, she said. Yes, he said, we have. They sat together in the cooling evening, and inside the house James turned over in his sleep, and Clara made some sound in hers, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the land that they had built together lay around them in the comfortable dark, real and paid for and theirs. And Abigail Keating Hunter felt the fullness of her life without any of the old vigilance at the edge of it. The autumn of 1892 brought news from Missouri that Nora and Francis were planning to move west. Francis had sold the dry goods store, and they had been watching the New Mexico territory for 2 years, and had found a piece of land outside of Santa Fe that suited them. Abigail read the letter at the kitchen table with James reading over her shoulder the way he did now, 9 years old and hungry for everything written, and when she looked up from it she was aware of something in her face that she could not keep fully managed. Ralph looked at her from across the table. "Good news," he said. "The best kind," she said. "My sister is coming west. They're buying land near Santa Fe." Ralph set down his coffee cup. "How far is Santa Fe?" he said in the tone of someone asking a question they know the answer to and are computing implications. 60 miles, she said, which is 1 day's ride or 3 hours by train. He looked at her face, the contained brightness of it, the thing she was not fully allowing herself, and said, "Abigail." "Yes," she said. "You can be happy about this," he said. "Fully. I give you permission." She looked at him and felt the laugh come up through her the way real laughter does from somewhere deep, from the place where the real things live, and she put her hand over his and said, "I don't need your permission, Ralph Hunter." "No," he agreed, with the full crinkle at his eyes. "You never did. It was a poor choice of words." James looked between them with the calm curiosity of a child who has grown up watching adults be honest with each other and finds it normal, which is one of the best things you can give a child. Clara, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point, said, "Is Aunt Nora coming?" And when Abigail said yes, Clara produced a sound of pure 4-year-old jubilation that startled the cat off the windowsill and made the whole kitchen laugh. Nora and Francis Webb settled near Santa Fe in the spring of 1893, and the 60 miles between them became a regular road. The Webbs came to Dust Creek in the summer months. The Hunters went to Santa Fe in the winter, and the Webb and Hunter children grew up knowing each other with the comfortable closeness of cousins who see each other often enough for it to matter. James Hunter grew into a young man who had his mother's precision and his father's steadiness, and a curiosity about the natural world that Abigail traced back to those evenings reading the natural history book. And in the autumn of 1897, at 13, he declared with complete certainty that he intended to study science and become a surveyor, because he liked knowing exactly where things were. Abigail and Ralph received this declaration with the satisfaction of parents who have produced someone who knows their own mind. Clara, at 9, had not yet announced her specific intentions, but had made it clear through daily demonstration that she was interested in horses, medicine, and arguing. And Dr. Harriet Lyle had declared her a promising candidate for the medical profession, which Clara received with the expression of someone who had suspected as much and was pleased to have it confirmed. On a November evening in 1897, exactly 15 years after the winter gathering where Jeb Craddock had made his soft proposal, and Ralph Hunter had asked what kind of promise she would take, Abigail sat at the kitchen table after supper doing the account books while Ralph sat across from her reading the newspaper that came weekly from Albuquerque. The children were asleep. The fire was settled. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down soft and quiet over the desert, and through the window the world was peaceful and white. She looked up from her numbers and looked at him, at the lines that the years had put in his face, the gray that had come into his dark hair at the temples, the way he held the newspaper with the same deliberate steadiness with which he held everything. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on that spring afternoon by the creek when the honey light was on them both, and she had finally let herself look at the actual man, not the potential problem of him. He looked up from the newspaper and found her looking, and the look that passed between them was one that had 15 years of daily life in it, 15 years of calving and drought and water disputes and childbirth and grief and laughing about chickens and building the apple orchard and breaking ice at dawn and sitting up with feverish children and showing up, always showing up, every ordinary, unremarkable, miraculous day. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking." He held her gaze with the warm, steady dark of his eyes. "Anything worth seeing," he said. "Everything," she said, and meant it without decoration, the way she meant everything she said. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, and their hands held in the middle of the account books and the Albuquerque newspaper, between the fire and the snow, in the kitchen of the home they had made on the land they had kept together, and the night was long and good around them, and would be there again in the morning. She had told him she had no use for a man with soft promises. He had made one hard promise and kept it every day. And every day, the ordinary ones and the hard ones and the brilliant ones, and the ones that were simply the plain fabric of a life being lived by two people who had chosen each other with the full knowledge of what choosing cost, every day turned out to be enough. It turned out to be more than enough. It turned out to be everything that two honest people, building carefully in the vast and beautiful and demanding country of the American West, could ever have asked for and more than most dared to hope. In the deep quiet of the November snow, with her children sleeping and her sister 60 miles and her husband's hand in hers, and the apple trees dormant in the yard waiting for spring, Abigail Keating Hunter pressed her thumb against the inside of Ralph's wrist and felt his pulse there, steady and certain as a kept promise, and she was not afraid of any of it, not even a little.